Welcome to this month's pattern of the month. We're going to be creating this adorable dress here. This dress has a tailored bodice, a unique neckline, and gorgeous billowing sleeves. It is a great dress for this hot summer weather, and this pattern comes in sizes 0 through 38, so a size for everyone. And you can get this pattern by joining my sewing club. There is a link down below in the description for that. And if you join the sewing club, in addition to this pattern, you're also going to get access to our sewing club Discord and some past patterns. And with every pattern in the sewing club, you're going to get bonus tutorials for all of the patterns. I'm going to give you different pattern hacks for each one, so that way you can tailor the patterns to your style. So definitely check it out, and it really helps support the channel too. So let's get started on this dress. And the first thing you need to do is print out your pattern and find your size. There are two print methods for this pattern. There's a large format copy that you can send to a print shop or use for your pattern projector. And there's also a home printer friendly version that you can print out on your home printer and tape it together. Now that you have your pattern printed out, let's take a few measurements so that way we know what size to cut out. So I want you to take your bust measurement, and I want you to measure the fullest part on your bust. So go ahead and measure right over the fullest part of your bust. Get that measurement and circle it on your size chart. After that, I want you to measure your natural waist. So this dress comes down to right about at your natural waist. So remember, if you can't find your natural waist, teacup to the side, and it's where you indent. And that's going to be your natural waist measurement. And keep the measuring tape fairly snug on you. You don't want to allow for a lot of extra ease in there. Otherwise, you're going to end up cutting out the wrong size pattern. So go ahead and circle both of those measurements on the size chart. For this pattern, we're using our bust and our waist measurements. So find those two numbers on the chart, go ahead and circle them. Now, if your measurements are, let's say, an 8 and a 16, you need to grade in or out your pattern, which is real easy to do. Let me show you what I mean real quick. I've already cut out my size, but here's the bust grade point and here's the waist grade point. So if you had a bigger bust, you'd select that bigger bust measurement and blend it into the waist. Or if you had a bigger waist measurement, you would come out for that number on the waist measurement and blend it to the underarm here. So you can go either way if your bust is bigger or if your waist is bigger. So what you want to do is connect the lines in between the two sizes. Now that the pattern's cut out in your size, let's go over the pieces you should have. You should have your sleeve, the sleeve cuff, we have the skirt, we have the bodice back and neck facing, and we have the bodice front and neck facing. And on the skirt, you have two length options. You can do the short version or you can do the longer version. I'm going to be doing the short version today, in which case you would just cut the pattern right at that dotted line there. So there are two different ways you can change the look of this pattern to really fit your personal style. One is through changing the shape of the neckline, and another is through changing the volume in the sleeve or the length of the sleeve. And if you're in the sewing club, that sleeve alteration video is going to be right down below for you. And if you're not in the sewing club, well, you're going to have to join to see it. So let's get started on this neckline. Right now the neckline is a V, but you might not be a V neckline person. Maybe you like a nice scoop. So I'm going to show you how to change this neckline. And you're not just limited to a scoop. You can make it any kind of neckline shape you want. Maybe you really like a square neckline. The first step in changing up this neckline is going to be to retrace out your pattern so we're not cutting up our original. So I've already retraced out my pattern, and now this over here where this V is my neckline. So now I need to decide on the shape of this U shape I want. So right here is center front, so this is going to mirror itself. So let's say you want to drop the neckline as well. I want to drop it 1 inch, so I'm going to measure 1 inch down and put a little mark on my paper. And now what you want to do is take your French curve, and we're going to blend from that new mark that I put up into the top of the shoulder, and then go ahead and draw your new neckline. Now the most important part of this is to make sure you have a nice right angle at center front, so that way when it mirrors itself, it's going to be nice and straight. And just remember that there's already seam allowance in the pattern, so wherever you draw your new neckline, it's going to come in an extra 1/4 of an inch. So if you don't want an extra 1/4 of an inch lower, make sure you draw that neckline 1/4 of an inch higher. But I'm happy with this one, so now I can go ahead and cut out my pattern. So now we have our new neckline on the front bodice. But after you draw your neckline, we also need to create a facing for it, so that way we can have a nice finished edge for our dress. So now I'm going to show you how to create a new facing. Now to create a new facing, you're going to retrace the neckline about 2 inches down from center front, trace that front neckline, trace the shoulder, and that's it. Now you're going to remove your pattern. And now what you're going to do is draw 2 inches away from that neckline towards the inside of where the pattern was. So this is going to be our new facing. So facing is always around 2.5 inches wide, up to you, depending on your pattern. I'm going to be making this one 2 inches wide. There we go. And there's our new facing piece. So this one is center front, on fold, and then this is our shoulder, which I usually label SHL. And now we can cut this one out. And we don't have to add any extra seam allowance because the neck already has the 1/4 inch in it, and the edge of the facing isn't attaching to anything, so we don't need any seam allowance there. So now I can cut this out, and I'll show you how it's going to fit onto the bodice. So you can see that when I place my facing on here, it matches up to the pattern piece perfectly. And now we can compare our original V-neck with the facing to our new scoop neck with the facing. So you can change your neckline to any shape that you want by following this process. You can also change the shape of the back neckline as well, doing the exact same thing. Now that you have your pattern adjusted to your size and style, it's time to cut out your fabric. And don't forget to check those grain lines and make sure you're cutting everything out right. Let's go over what you should have cut out in fabric. You should have 2 sleeves cut out on fold. You should have 2 cuffs cut out on fold. And you should have 4 skirts. That's right, 4 skirts cut out on fold. You should have your back facing cut out on fold. You should have a back bodice cut out on fold. You should have a front bodice cut out on fold. And you should have a front facing cut out on fold. And I want to add that both of the facing pieces also need inner facing cut out on fold. And for the inner facing, I suggest using a comparable weight to your fabric. So I have a pretty lightweight fabric here today, so I have a pretty lightweight fusible inner facing that I'll be using. And you're also gonna need 2 pieces of elastic for your cuff and an invisible zipper. And to ensure you get a proper fit for your elastic at the bottom of your arm, you don't want it too tight, you don't want it too loose, the best thing to do is take it and wrap it around your arm and make it the same size as the bottom of your arm. Now you can change this up. If you made your sleeve longer and you want it down at your wrist, you might need it smaller. But if you're following the pattern as is, take the elastic and wrap it around the bottom of your arm for the perfect length. There is one more thing you need to cut. So your skirt was cut 4, but I want you to take one of those panels and cut it in half. And we're doing this because we have a side seam zipper, and it'll make sense later when we're sewing it all together. So you're gonna take one of your panels and open it up and lay it out. Go ahead and take the pattern and line it up on top. And now the side where it says fold, we're just gonna cut right next to it. We're gonna cut it in half. And there we go. Now one of our panels is cut in half. So now our skirt is all prepped and we are ready to put this dress together. And even if you're not sewing along with me right now, you are gonna learn lots of tips and tricks with gathering fabric, working with lighter fabric, marking those darts, getting that facing perfect. So you definitely wanna follow along to the end so you can see how this beautiful dress happens. The first thing we're gonna do is prep the skirt. Let's sew all of the panels of the skirt together. So I have my 3 full panels laid out and we're gonna sew them together right here. So then they're going to be one big panel. So 3 panels in the one. And then we're going to take these pieces that we cut in half and we're going to sew them to the ends, one on each side. And you wanna make sure that you're sewing the angled end to the side of the skirt. So the side that's straighter, you want that on the outside because that's where we're going to be putting our zipper on the side seam here. And it's going to set in best if we have the straight grain there. When we sew these panels, we're going to be placing them right sides together. So we have 4 straight seams to sew together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I have a straight stitch selected and I'm sewing a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Don't forget to back stitch at the beginning and the end of your seams. Back stitch at the end and cut, and now we're going to move on to our next panel. And now we're done sewing all the skirt panels together. And next, we're going to be finishing our edges. And we're going to do this a little bit different than normal. So I'm going to do my edge finishes a little differently with my seams because I'm working with a delicate fabric and I want to add as much strength to the seam as I can. So what I'm going to do now is serge my seam together. So we'll have the serge on the edge and then our regular seam right next to it. And then after I serge together all of my seams, then I'll go around the perimeter of my skirt and serge the edges to finish it off. And if you don't have a serger, these seams that we just sewed together, you could also make them French seams. You could add bias binding to them, or you can overcast or zigzag them to prevent them from fraying any further. So you definitely have some finishing options. So you can see I have my stitch over here to the left, and I'm just gonna serge the seam allowance here together. And now you're gonna do the same thing to the rest of the seams. Now that I've serged all my seams together, I'm just gonna go around the edge of my entire skirt. So there's just one layer here. And don't forget, when you're turning corners, make sure you come about one stitch off. Make sure your needles are up, lift up your foot, give it a little pull to the back, and turn and reposition. And when you get to these seams that are serged together, just make sure they're pushed one direction. And make sure they're pushed the same direction when you're serging the hem. And now we're done serging the skirt. So you can see we have our nice serge on the bottom of our skirt. You can also see that we have the edge serged. You can also see that we have our seam serged together here for a nice clean finish. Now that our skirt is all together in its one piece, it's time to work on our bodice. The first thing we're going to do on our bodice is mark our darts. And you're gonna notice that these darts are not in a traditional spot. They are going on an angle to the center front and center back of the bodice, which is very flattering. So these darts are awesome. There's different ways you can mark your darts and transfer them, but I'm going to be using an awl for the tip of the dart. And for the bottom of the dart, I'm going to be snipping into it. Now, one dart leg is where the point is, and the other dart leg is actually at center back here. So we are going to clip in right at center back, just 1/4 of an inch, and then we're going to clip in right at that point, 1/4 of an inch. Now we're gonna do the same thing to the other side by just flipping the pattern over. Now that I have the points of my dart marked, I'm going to draw them in so you can really see these lines. So line up your dart tip with one of your dart leg bottoms. And now move it over to your other dart leg tip. So you can really see how these darts start at the center back and angle out. Once you have your darts drawn in, they should look something like this. Now I know you're not used to darts looking like this, but trust me, it's going to look so cool when it's sewn up. Now we're gonna mark the darts on the front. You're also gonna notice that they're going on an angle. So go ahead, mark your dart tip, and then mark your dart legs down here. So one again is that little tip of the triangle, and then the other one is here at center front on an angle. Now flip your pattern over and mark the other side and draw them in. Now the darts marked on the front should look something like that. It's basically making an M. Now that our darts are all drawn in, it's time to go sew them up. And if you really need some help with sewing your darts, make sure you check out my online Sewing 101 course. Starting with my front darts, starting at my waist, I'm going to back stitch at that center front. I'm going to follow my chalk line that I drew. Remove my pins when I get to them, and gradually blend off to the tip. Making sure that I'm coming one stitch off, adding a back stitch, and cut. And then I'm going to do the same thing to the other front dart. Now I'm going to sew the back darts. Again, starting at the waist, making sure I'm back stitching, and continuing up to the tip of the dart. Coming one stitch off and back stitching. And now I'm going to do the same thing to my other dart. Now that we're done with our darts, let's check them out. So you can see our darts forming the V on the front and the back. So we took our M and we made it a V. Now we're gonna sew some of our bodice together. We're gonna place right sides together, as always, right? And we're gonna sew up the right-hand side seam and the shoulders. Make sure you leave the left side open because our invisible zipper is going to go there. So we're going to sew here, here, and here. And then after that, we're going to serge those seams together, just like we did on the skirt. And don't forget, your seam allowance is a 1/2 inch. And now these seams you just sewed together, you're going to serge the seam together. Let's take a look at the seams we just sewed and serged. So your seam should be looking like that right now. Nice sewn seam and a nice finished edge on the right side seam and the shoulders. Now we have a little bit more edge finishing to do. This raw edge at the waist of the bodice, I'm going to serge that all the way around. And then the side seams over here on the left side, we're also going to serge those. But we're not going to serge the armhole or the neck. And you might be wondering, why aren't I serging the armholes and the neckline? Well, there's a method to my madness, so you're just going to have to wait and find out. I'm going to start with one of the side seams and then work my way to the waist. Make sure when you're serging the dart underlay that these darts, the underlay is actually facing the side seams. Now we're all serged up. Now that we have those edges serged, it's time to move on to the neck facing. Now we need to attach the fusible inner facing to our facings, and then we can do some sewing. So we're going to take the bumpy side of the inner facing and put it on the wrong side of the facing, and then we're going to fuse it down for the front and the back. Now that we have the fusible on the back of the facing, we're going to sew these facings right sides together. To put together this neck facing, we need to first sew together the shoulders with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. After we sew it together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're then going to serge the seam together like we have been with all of our seams. And then we're going to open up the facing. There we go, there's our neckline. And now what we're going to do is serge all the way around the outside. Do not serge the inside of the neck facing. So we're facing all finished. We got that inner facing on there, the shoulders are sewn together, and we have the seams and all the way around the outside of the facing serged. Our next step is going to be sewing that facing to the bodice neck. I'm going to start by applying the front facing to the front bodice. I'm going to line it up at the shoulders first, and then I'm going to make sure that all of my points match. So if you're using the original neckline, you're going to notice that there's these extra points out here, kind of creating this unique neck shape. So line up those points. Line up your V at the bottom. Now, if you are using a loose fabric, there's a chance that it's stretching or moving a little bit on you. And this is a great time to pin it into place. And then you can also pin in between your points here. If you chose your own neckline, just go ahead and pin your facing all the way around your neckline. And now that I have the front pin, I'm going to flip it over to the back. Now I'm going to pin the back together, matching all my points. All finished pinning. Now what we're going to do is sew all the way around the neckline with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure we pivot at all of those points. So I have my fabric lined up with a 1/4 inch, and I'm just going to go all the way around the neck. Back stitch and cut when you get back to where you left off. Now that we have the facing sewn on, it's time to clip, flip, and understitch. So you're gonna clip at all 3 points on each side. So the front, make sure you're clipping right to the stitch, but not through it. And then the same thing with these other ones here. We're clipping at these points to release the tension in the fabric, so that way when it flips, it's nice and smooth. So if you flip it and you notice any puckers at those points, you need to go and clip further. And now we're gonna take the facing and flip it to the inside. So I have my facing flipped to the inside, and what we're going to do is add this little understitch just to the facing piece. So when we sew, we have to lay these 2 layers flat apart and make sure our seam allowance is facing the facing. And then we're going to stitch it down to the facing, 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. I have my facing to the right, and I have my seam allowance right under that facing. And I have my seam lined up with the 1/8 of an inch spot, so that way I can have a nice, perfect 1/8 of an inch understitch. And when I get to those points in the neckline, I'm going to leave my needle in, lift up my foot, and pivot. Needle in, foot up, and pivot. You get back to where you started, back stitch, and cut. Our facing is finished. Let's take a look at the details. Look at that beautiful edge stitch right on the facing, holding that facing under. And you'll notice that there's no stitches on the outside of the dress. They're just all on the inside of the facing. And to further finish off the facing, I've stitched in the ditch right at the shoulder, making this nice and secure, and made sure that my seam allowance on the sleeve was pushed in. Now, if any of the other spots are popping up for you and not staying down because we don't have any other seams, just like do a little hand stitch or a little hand tack to keep that facing down. Now that our bodice and facing is complete, it's time to work on the sleeves. So grab those giant sleeves, and I'm going to show you how to put them together. So we have a giant sleeve that we are going to end up gathering at the bottom and at the top to bring it in and have a nice drapey sleeve. So the first thing we want to do is add our gathering stitches across the top of the sleeve and the bottom. Now there's many ways you can gather. Today I'm going to be using the basting method. So basically what we're going to do is put 2 rows of basting stitches at the top and the bottom, and then we're going to scrunch up the fabric with those basting stitches. So let's go add some basting stitches. So a basting stitch is just a straight stitch with a really long stitch length. Now my machine goes up to 5 millimeters, so I'm doing my max stitch length of 5. Some machines go up to 6 or even 8. So I'm adding my first row of basting stitches 3/8 of an inch away from the edge. I'm not going to back stitch. This is going to allow me to gather the fabric from both ends. Now I don't need to go all the way to the end of the sleeve. I'm going to stop about 3 inches away from the underarm seam. Lift up my foot and pull out plenty of thread that we can use later for gathering. Now I'm going to start again at the same end I started before. Again, about 3 inches away from the underarm seam. And this time I'm going to place this stitch 3/8 of an inch away from that last stitch. So for me, edge of the foot with my last row of stitches. No back stitch. And we're just going to use that last row of stitches as our guide to go all the way around the top of the sleeve. And such a big, fabulous sleeve this is. Now I'm at the end of that stitch, 3 inches before the underarm seam. Lift up my foot and pull out plenty of thread. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom of my sleeve and on the other sleeve. Now I have all of the basting stitches in. Let's take a look at them real quick. So I have my basting stitches in at the top, and they're starting and ending 3 inches away from that underarm seam. And I have those basting stitches at the bottom, and they're ending 1 inch away from the underarm seam down here. Now that I have those basting stitches in, we're going to sew together the underarm. So go ahead and place it right sides together. We're going to sew up a 1/2 inch seam here, and then we're going to serge it together. Just make sure that you keep these long basting stitches out of the way when you sew up this seam, because we're going to use those next. So I have my machine set to a straight stitch with a regular stitch length, and I'm going to sew this underarm together on the sleeve. Back stitch at the end and cut. And now it's time to serge it together. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing to the other sleeve. Now I have both of the underarm seams sewn up and serged together on the sleeves. Now we're going to move on to gathering up the bottom of the sleeve into our cuff. But the first thing we need to do is sew our cuff together. So we're going to take the short sides, place them together, and sew it up at 1/2 inch. Now you don't have to serge the seam together. You totally could if you want. So I've sewn up the short side on the cuff, and then I ironed it open. Next, you're going to take the cuff, fold it in half, line up that seam you just ironed open, and now we're going to iron it in half. So that way we get a nice strong crease at the bottom of the cuff. So I'm just going to press this in half, then I'm going to turn it and keep pressing it until the edges are nice and crisp. There we go. Now I have my cuff nice and pressed. And I'm gonna do the same thing to the other one. Now it's time to do some gathering. We're gonna gather up the bottom of the sleeve into the cuff. So what we're going to do is take both of the basting stitches from one side only, and we're gonna hold them in our hand. And then we're gonna take our fabric and we're gonna scrunch it up along those basting stitches. We're just gonna work it all the way around. Or what you can do is just work half of it, and then you can actually take the basting stitches on the other side, grab the same side of basting stitches, and pull your fabric and work your way to the other halfway point. So sometimes it's really nice when you have a lot of fabric to go from both sides, so that way you don't have to get the gathers here all the way over to there, to the other side. So when you roughly have it the same size as your cuff, we're going to take the cuff, place it right sides together, line up the seam on your cuff with the underarm seam on your sleeve. And now what we're going to do is pin the gathers to the cuff all the way around. You're going to notice that the cuff is folded in half. And while you're doing this, you want to adjust the gathers to the size of your cuff, because those gathers do move along the basting stitches. So you can move them right around wherever you need them, which is the nice part about using the basting method. And if you need to cinch them up, you can cinch up the gathers more. If you need to let them out, you can let them out. Just line up all 3 layers. Now you might be wondering, why haven't I serged anything yet? And that's because we're gonna go back after we sew this and get the elastic in and serge all the layers together. This way it's not gonna be as bulky with all of the layers and the fabrics and the gathers. The serge is going to kind of crunch it up together and make it smoother. So now I'm going to work on this side. You always want to make sure that the raw edges are lining up with each other, because if any of these little edges are tucked in, you're going to see that on the outside of your garment. Okay, now that I have the cuff pinned in here, we are going to sew up most of it. We're going to leave a little 1-inch opening over here, so that way we can get our elastic in. I'm sewing this up at 1/2 inch. Now all these extra basting threads you have in here, just kind of pull them out of the way. We're going to cut them off after. And while you're sewing the gathers, if you need to adjust any of the gathers while you're sewing, you totally can. Just adjust them before your stitch gets to them. I like to engage my needle down button when I'm doing this too, because I usually do a lot of adjusting and moving it around and manipulating it with my fingers. Okay, so now I'm getting back to where I started. I still have gathers here, which is fine. We're not going to remove the basting stitches yet, but I'm going to add a few back stitches and stop so I can get my elastic in my cuff. So I have my elastic attached to a safety pin, and I'm going to find the opening in the cuff here, and I'm going to push it all the way through to the other side. When you're doing this, make sure your elastic doesn't get flipped or turned, and just work your way all the way through. Also make sure you don't lose the other end of it in there. Okay, Here's my opening. I'm just gonna pull out some of the elastic here. Okay, so now we can remove the safety pin. But now what we need to do is sew these two pieces of elastic together. And you have two options. You can take them and overlap them on each other about 1/4 inch and sew them back and forth and secure them, or you can take them, butt them up to each other, put your zigzag stitch on, and zigzag over the raw edges. It's going to keep it flatter inside of your cuff. I'm going to be going with this method today. So I have both of the edges butted up right next to each other. I have my zigzag stitch set. I'm going to work my way all the way to the bottom of this. I'm going to hit the back stitch button and I'm going to go backwards all the way to the top. I'm going to come all the way down to the bottom again. I'm going to add a few back stitches and cut. And now that seam should be nice and secure. Now that we have the elastic sewn together, it's time to pull our cuff and it's going to go right into the cuff. And there we go. Our elastic is inside of our cuff. But remember, we left that hole up here. So what we need to do is go back and stitch up that hole in the cuff, and then we're gonna serge all the edges together and it's gonna clean it up. So I sewed up that opening with a straight stitch right here. And now I'm gonna serge all the layers together. Our cuff is all finished and it's looking great. Our sleeve is looking awesome. I'm so excited about these sleeves. Now let's get the sleeve into the armhole of the dress. You'll notice that one of the side seams is open so we can get the zipper in there, but we need to close it up a bit so that way we can put our sleeve in here. So on the left-hand side here, you're gonna sew up this side seam 1 inch from the underarm down. So after you've sewn it up, it's gonna look just like this. It's just a little 1 inch seam right here and then it opens up. So now we're gonna gather up the sleeve and set it into the armhole here. And now the sleeves are symmetrical. There's no right or left to the sleeve. So grab one of the sleeves, remember to take 2 of your basting stitches and then hold the basting stitch and pull the fabric. Now, since we have so much fabric, I'm gonna gather up one side to roughly the middle of the sleeve, and then I'm gonna go over to the other side and then start gathering that one. Now I didn't gather the bottom 3 inches of the underarm because I don't want gathers in my underarm. So now I'm going to take the 2 threads on this side, hold them, and pull the fabric down. So you're basically trying to scrunch up the fabric the same length as the armhole. When you think you have it close, we are good to start pinning. So I think that looks roughly right. So we're gonna place right sides together and we need to make sure we're lining up our underarm seam with the side seam of the dress. So I'm gonna find my underarm seam and I'm going to line it up with the side seam on the dress. So that's where I'm going to start lining up. So we're gonna pin that bottom 3 inches on both sides flat. Now you could put gathers down here if you want, totally up to you. You could even just keep 2 inches flat. It's really going to be a personal choice in the style of it, but I suggest about 3 inches flat on each side of the underarm seam and then making the rest of the sleeve gathered. After I pin that flat part, I like to really assess and see how much gather do I have going on around it, and do I have it evenly gathered roughly. I want to make sure I don't have too many gathers in one spot. So now I'm going to pin all the way around the armhole, pinning those gathers in place. Now that my armhole is nice and pinned with the sleeve, I can sew it together. We're going to be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then we're going to serge both layers together. I'm going to start at the underarm seam. I'm using a straight stitch with a stitch length of 2, my fine fabric. And I'm going to work my way all the way around the armhole. Notice that I've taken off the back of my sewing machine so that way I can sew around in a circle nice and easy. I'm going to take out my pins before I get to them. Back stitch when you get back to where you started and cut. Now it's time to serge these 2 layers together. So by serging the 2 layers together, it's gonna help control all this extra bulk in the gathers. So I have my fabric in the machine and I've put it in parallel to the foot. So when I start, I'm gonna get a nice straight serge. I'm just gonna work my way all the way around the armhole. If you still got those basting stitches in there, you can remove them. You can lightly pull them or use your seam ripper to remove them. You get back to where you started, overlap your serge, and serge off. We finished one sleeve. Let's check it out. Look at how amazing the sleeve looks. We have our gathers up here on the top. We got our gathers on the bottom. We have this nice flowy sleeve. I cannot wait to try this on. Now I'm gonna finish up the rest of the steps on that other sleeve and sew it into the bodice. The top of the dress is looking so amazing with both of the sleeves in it. Let's take a look at it. I cannot wait to get the skirt on this, a zipper, hem it, and then we get to try it on. Now we're gonna start on the skirt and we're going to add basting stitches all the way along the waist. So 2 rows of basting stitches, so that way we can gather it up into the bodice. We're gonna do the same thing we did to the sleeves. We're gonna put 2 rows of basting stitches in. All finished with the basting. Now that our basting stitches are in, we need to find the center of the 3 panels that are here. Now the easiest way to do this is take your panel, line up the seams, and find exactly where that half point is, and then just take your chalk or a pin and go ahead and mark this. So we need this mark later for when we are gathering, so that way we can distribute the gathers evenly. So I've marked the center of the 3 big panels, not the little ones. Now we're ready to gather up the top of this skirt and pin it to the bottom of the bodice. First, I'm going to gather it up roughly how much I think I need it gathered up. And then we're going to line up our seams and those center points with different spots on the bodice, like center front and our side seams and center back. One tip I have, if you are working with a heavier fabric, this basting method of gathering might be breaking on you. You can always try the zigzag method, or you can also try gathering foot. So I've gathered from one end, and now I'm going to go over to the other end and gather towards center. Okay, so now that I have my skirt gathered up, we are going to match our seams and chalk marks on the bodice. So I pinned the side seam, and I want you to line up that first chalk mark with center back. So I'm going to just pin all of my spots that I've marked first. So I have center back and the side seam marked. And now what we're going to do is line up the side seam with the next chalk mark. We're going to work our way around, and we're going to line up center front with the next chalk mark that you made. And now we're just going to line up our other side seam with the end of our skirt. And now I'm going to pin in between each mark, evening out these gathers. So now I have the entire waist pinned into the bodice, and I have all the gathers evened out in between all of those points. I'm sewing a 1/2 inch seam with a stitch length of 2.0. Back stitch at the end, and we are finished with that waist seam. The skirt is attached at the waist and looks beautiful with all of those gathers. Now it's time to add our invisible zipper to the side seam. And if you need help with your invisible zippers, make sure you check out my online Sewing 101 class. So we're going to put that zipper here in the side seam, and the first thing we're going to do is unzip it, flip it over to one side, and sew right next to those zipper teeth, so that way we get a nice invisible zipper. And then we're going to do the same thing to the other side of the zipper. And then what we need to do is close up the bottom. So then we'll close up the bottom of the zipper, and voila, we'll have our invisible zipper. So here's the inside of the dress with the invisible zipper, and you can see that I put a little cap on the end because I shortened my zipper and I stitched down my zipper tails. And on the outside of our dress, our zipper is hidden here in the side seam. There's a little zipper pull, and then all the way down, you can't even tell we have a zipper in there. We are almost finished. We literally have one step left. All we need to do is hem the dress. Now I'm going to be adding a little single folded hem. I used a very casual fabric, very light and flowy. You could add horsehair to the hem. You could do bias binding at the hem. You could do a blind hem. You could do a rolled hem. There's so many options for your hem, but today I'm keeping it simple and just going with a single folded hem. I'm gonna start at one of the seams, add a few back stitches, and work my way all the way around this big, beautiful hem. And we're done with the hem. We finished. Let's take a look at all the details that went into this dress. We have our cool angled darts front and back. We have our beautiful neck facing with our understitch. We have these gathered puff sleeves at the top and at the bottom with that cool cuff with the elastic in it. We have our invisible side seam zipper. We have our beautiful gathered waist with all of our different panels in it and our gorgeous single folded hem. All of these details made up a beautiful summer dress. And here's the dress on. I just love the volume in these sleeves and in the skirt. It's a lot, but it's not too much. And don't forget, there's a longer version of the skirt. So if you want it below the knee, there's definitely that version for you as well. Also, think about further modifications with this pattern. You could totally just use it as a bodice pattern and wear it with some high-waisted shorts or jeans, or just sew a little bit of the skirt onto the bodice and wear it as a blouse. There are a lot of different options for this pattern here, and I hope you have so much fun sewing this up, because I know I did, and I already have my next fabrics picked out for this dress. And I designed this dress to work well with all body types. So over here we have a 24 and over here we have a 4. But this pattern comes in sizes 0 through 38. These full sleeves and this full skirt, they translate to so many different types of bodies. And remember, right now you can get this pattern through my sewing club, and we just created the Discord for the sewing club, so make sure you check that out too. There's a link down below in the description. And if you're not familiar with Discord, it's an online platform where we can meet and connect, share our sewing victories and woes. And obviously just hang out together because we all love sewing. And if you make this dress, make sure you send me photos, tag me in photos. I cannot wait to see what fabulous fabrics you guys choose for this dress. Thanks so much for watching today. I hope you guys really enjoyed sewing up this new design with me. If you have any questions, leave it down below in the comments and I'll get back with you as soon as I can. And if you're not already a subscriber to Sewing Anastasia, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you know when the new videos come out. And if you're already a subscriber, well, thank you so much for watching today. These videos are for you guys. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, all the socials, that way we can stay connected and creative together. And if you're in Chicago, come on into the design studio and take some sewing classes with me in person. And if you're not, well, check out the online sewing academy that I created. There's a link down below for both. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.